Welcome back, adventurers! Last time, we left our intrepid explorers on the brink of a thrilling new chapter. Our protagonist found himself entangled in a world of beauty and danger, and his heart was caught in a whirlwind of emotions. Now, prepare to be captivated as we delve deeper into this tale of adventure, love, and unexpected alliances. The journey westward continues, and with it comes new challenges, heart-wrenching decisions, and a clash of cultures that will test our heroes to their limits. Will they find redemption? Will they uncover the truth about Amy's past? And what secrets lie hidden in the vast expanse of the American frontier? Get ready for a wild ride as we unravel the mysteries of this captivating story. Let's dive in. It's a business. Chapter 2. That's how I met May Bailey. She was orphaned after her parents died during one of the periodic yellow fever epidemics in New Orleans. But her beauty was already in full glory. So she immediately caught the eye of Joseph Samuel, a wealthy cotton merchant. He adopted her, even though she had already turned 18, and kept her in luxurious style in a house in the French Quarter. In the Big Easy, the attitude is quite different. So to have a mistress as young and stunningly beautiful as May was, is a badge of honor for her benefactor. Then Samuel died. It has been suggested that his extensive heart failure might have had something to do with the great difference in their ages and his infatuation. But May was an indestructible woman, and she had her own famous beauty to lean on. So she quickly found herself another cotton magnate named Herman. He was even older and richer than her previous conqueror, and May made a deal that the house would pass to her upon his death. The man's inevitable demise came 3 years later. He was buried with a smile on his face, and May received the property and some money. May told me that she was tired of being taken care of by men. She had no marketable skills, other than what she had acquired during her 7 years as a professional mistress. So she went with her strength. She turned her new residence into an upscale knockout shop that attracted the wealthy planters and merchants of the area. The talent she collected ranged from poor Creole girls to unruly daughters. They were all the colors of the rainbow, including red and yellow. But they all had one thing in common. Like May, they were exceptionally beautiful. In fact, by the time I met her, May was something of a New Orleans legend. She even had a house of ill fame license from the city. May might be rich and powerful, but she couldn't have children. She told me this information one crying night. She said she liked me because she imagined I looked like the son she would never have. That statement was more than disturbing. I didn't know what to say. My only experience with a woman had been with Vera. And inevitably, at that thought, I experienced a flash of painful regret. So I did what I would have done with my ex-wife. I stroked May's back and hugged her while she cried. I said quite seriously, "You know, the priest might have a problem if I were really your son?" She looked at me sadly and said, "I know, dear boy. It's just that I have grown very fond of you in my own way, and it's time for you to go." This was news to me. I asked, puzzled, "Go away. Where am I going?" May smiled welcomingly and said, "I have an arrangement with one of my girls. We're going to open an establishment in Denver. There's gold there, and we're going to split the profits. That's if I provide the stock." I had visions of cattle drives. I asked, "What does this have to do with me?" May replied, "It's a long and dangerous journey. That is why I am sending you along with Patrick to see to it that they get there." Patrick was the very essence of a smiling Irishman. I liked him. He was 10 years older than me, and he had one of those classic Irish faces, hooded eyes, long narrow nose, bushy eyebrows, and an accent that hinted at thievery and good cheer. He came here during the Great Famine and made his way in every way he could. He worked as a bartender downstairs, serving booze and brambles as much as I did upstairs. I may have been a little resentful of being unceremoniously kicked out of the nest, but I was excited at the prospect of new adventures. It had been almost a month since I'd walked through May's door. We weren't sure if Adams was still looking for me, so I was confined to the upper floors of the house and tried to remain invisible. At night, I spent time with Madame, but we were both getting uncomfortable. I had always been daring, and a trip to the Wild West was just the sort of prospect I could sink my teeth into. Even if only as trail boss for a herd of women moving westward, I would miss May. But we both knew our interlude wouldn't last long. I was 20 years younger than she was, and she was a madam. So a week later, we traveled upriver on the steamer Natchez, our destination, Hannibal, Missouri. It was my first trip on a steamboat, and it was amazing. The large stern oars were turned by a powerful engine in the bow of the boat. It puffed and puffed against the current, making as much as 5 knots. That was a miracle in itself, for a sailor like me. The steam clearly had a future. May saw us off at the cotton docks at the end of Ursuline Avenue. She hugged me goodbye and said, "Be good, my beautiful boy. I'll never forget you." Was that a tear in her eye? May Bailey may have been a night butterfly and a madam, but she was a strong and independent woman and one of the kindest and noblest souls I have ever known. She sailed on her own star and never moved an inch in her whole life. It was obvious that May was helping me get out of town. Fate has a sense of humor after all. Who would have thought I would escape by sending a party of women on a 1,000-mile journey to the promised land? There were 8 girls in our group, all stunningly beautiful. 2 of them, Aphrodite and Bathsheba, were former slaves. Lynn was exotically oriental. Abigail was a planter's daughter. She seemed to enjoy her work. Then there were 3 Mexican beauties, Itzel, Nelly, and Tepin. They were sisters from Veracruz, sold into the trade by their parents. And finally, there was Marie Aimée. She called herself Amy, as all Cajun girls carried the name Virgin Mary. She was May's business partner. I hadn't seen her almost since I arrived. She'd been around for a while. But while I was in hiding, she kept a low profile. I think she was told to stay away. It's since become clear that I find her deadly attractive. Amy was a Louisiana Creole who was called a quadroon by the locals. This meant that one of her grandparents was black. This fortunate amalgamation resulted in a woman of magical beauty. She had a pointed, intellectual nose over a stunningly sensual mouth, thick, silky, raven-colored hair, framing a classic facial oval, a high, intelligent forehead, and beautiful eyes of a dark shade of purple. Yes, I said purple. The contrast between Amy's golden skin and her expressive eyes was so striking that men would literally stop and stare at her as if mesmerized. In addition, an indescribable fragrance emanated from her. Perhaps it was voodoo sorcery, or perhaps it was just Amy. Whatever it was, it turned all the men around her into drooling idiots, including me. As I noted, she was 5'6" and had a cat-like good body. She moved like a panther in a bayou. May dressed me as if I were her child. The clothes were stylish and sophisticated, right down to the ruffled shirts and the cane. Underneath, however, I was still a former harpooner, and it showed through the dapper outfits. It was the same with the girls. All of our charges were dressed in the finest French fashions and behaved like high-born ladies, just as May had taught them. Nevertheless, most of the men on the ship guessed who they were. So Patrick and I had to work hard to convince the male passengers not to touch the merchandise. I was larger than most, 6'2" and 220 pounds. So all I had to do was gently encourage good behavior. Patrick was a fiery carcass 5'7" and 180 pounds, and the Irish would pounce on him if the boys took liberties, especially Aphrodite, whom he seemed to have a thing for. This led to his throwing an important piece of bling into the Mississippi, which nearly got us thrown off the ship. Luckily, they fished it out and Amy smoothed his ruffled feathers. She didn't do it herself. That job was given to Abigail, who was happy to do the task. Seriously, there's something wrong with that girl's head. Natchez pulled into Hannibal, Missouri, like he was parking a wagon. As a sailor, I was disgusted at the ineptitude of the process. They just drove it up to the dock and launched it. We unloaded our cargo, among which were so many trunks and valises that there would have been enough for Napoleon's army on campaign, and then loaded it all into a private car on the Hannibal to St. Joe Railroad line. We then traveled to the port of St. Joe on the Missouri River. The trip by rail took half a day, and early the next morning, we and our charges were loaded on the steamer Excel for the 2-day trip to Kansas City. Kansas City was then called Kansas City, and it did not yet have the trappings of a cow town because the railroad had not yet reached there. It bordered on exsanguinated Kansas. Thanks to the Kansas-Nebraska law, there was fighting all over the area between the bushwhackers and the Jayhawkers. President Buchanan had sent enough federal troops to pacify the area, and we didn't stay there long. We just had to outfit a couple of wagons to hit the Santa Fe Trail. By 1860, the trail had been in operation for more than 30 years. The deep ruts that marked its path testified to the thousands of people who had traveled westward through the Kansas Territory. The train we joined was like a military expedition, with elected officers and armed men to scout and protect the main group. It operated according to a certain routine, rising at 4 in the morning, leaving at 7. We traveled 10 or 15 miles a day, depending on the terrain. We bought a Conestoga to carry cargo. The white cotton sailcloth on the Conestoga is why they were called prairie schooners. It was hinged front and back to better protect the cabin during a storm. That way it looked like a sail. Each wagon held about 2 tons of cargo. Reindeer were preferred, as the larger number of mules needed for traction would have been troublesome to maintain. The Aspens were not manageable with reins, so we hired a couple of boys to walk alongside and steer them. Since schooners on the prairie had no suspension and the trails were rough, most people preferred to walk rather than endure the constant painful jolts and lurching of the wagon. So we bought an overland stagecoach to give the girls basic comfort. It had suspension, and the passengers didn't suffer much bumping and jolting, but it rocked a lot. I sat on the driver's box holding the reins and guiding the mules. Driving was difficult at first. I was a sailor, not a commodore, but if you practice it a few hours a day, you can master anything. I changed my gentlemanly attire to the boots, canvas pants, large neck scarf, and plaid shirt, worn by all the men on the train. This was all complemented by a large Stetson hat to protect me from the weather. I even had a waterproof duster in case the weather became too unfavorable. To my utter amazement, Amy came upstairs with me. It takes courage and stamina to sit for hours in the heat and dust of the Kansas prairie. As a whaler and blue water sailor, I've dealt with hardship all my life. But Amy was by far the most beautiful and exotic of all women. Nevertheless, Amy sat beside me day after day. It was as if she sensed that the endless expanse made me uneasy. I suppose people out west would have felt the same anxiety on the open ocean that was my fiefdom. Her calming presence and quiet strength encouraged me to be the man she needed. Amy wore man clothes when she rode with me. It was just common sense given the harsh conditions. With her attire, she was attracting a lot of stares. In return, Amy looked at the immigrant men with obvious disdain and showed nothing but anger and contempt for their wives. Amy always did what she thought was right and hated petty judgments. In the afternoon, we rode behind the Conestoga. We had to keep up with the oxen. Pat drove the big wagon along with a random team of kids. They made sure the oxen kept in line and kept up. Surprisingly, Aphrodite walked beside Pat the whole time, chatting and laughing. It was comical because Pat was 5'7" and Aphrodite was about 6 feet tall. But apparently, the two had bonded at their previous jobs and were in love in their own way. Pat was Irish, and the Irish suffered from bigotry in those days, whereas Aphrodite was a black-skinned lady of the night. Of course, this caused a storm of moral outrage from the righteous members of the train. Nevertheless, no one ever said anything overtly provocative to them because Pat had already been punished for various misdemeanors. He had a temper. Both Pat and Aphrodite knew that human nature could not be changed. People would believe what they believed, so they ignored the sanctimonious views and enjoyed each other's company. In many ways, it was the best revenge. Amy and I never talked. We just sat there, friendly for mile after mile. It was like she was saying we were in this together. I respected her unwavering spirit, and our partnership grew as we moved west. You might even call it a crush. If such a thing can happen between a traveling sailor and a potential madam. She even cast a friendly glance at me sometimes as we walked side by side. We really were a couple. The route through Kansas followed the north bank of the Arkansas River. The guides called this route the wet route because there was a lot of grass and water. The dry route took much less time, but there was very little water. Only thirsty beavers traveled this route. At Fort Dodge, the trail bifurcates again. There, hurrying people could take the South Fork that followed the Cimarron River. It passed through Comanche territory, and these people are notoriously inhospitable. So those who chose this path often regretted it. We turned at a mountain fork. Every mile was a test of physical strength, even with 6 oxen. The trail itself was a perpetual mess of ruts, mud, and steep climbs. I was one of the biggest and strongest men. and they needed my strength to pull the wagons across the various ravines and fords. After we set up camp, Amy spent all her time with the women. Of course, that was to be expected. Still, I missed her company. The feeling of dissatisfaction was foreign. I hadn't felt intimacy with anyone since the day I'd kissed Faith goodbye. Strangely, Amy seemed as lonely as I was, even as she sat among the crowd of gossiping women. Every once in a while, I even noticed her looking at me thoughtfully, like we were a real couple. I kept telling myself she had the wrong one, but throughout the journey, she was only unwaveringly loyal and reassuring. The presence of 8 gorgeous and clearly the most beautiful women was a problem in a camp full of men. So Pat and I slept under each end of the Conestoga, where the girls were positioned. Under our pillow, we carried 2 fully loaded Colt 44 Army pistols. In the driver's box, we also kept a lever-action Henry 45, 70 caliber repeater, and a 10th gauge shotgun. Our destination was the old Bent's Fort, located on the Arkansas River. It was about 500 miles from Kansas City. From there, we were to turn north on the Cherokee Trail toward Denver. It was another 2 months' journey. We reached the Colorado River, west of Fort Lyon, to where the 2 trails diverge, and camped in a cottonwood forest along the Arkansas River. It was deep into the night. I was about to fall asleep when I heard someone slip stealthily out from behind me, just above my head, and walk toward the riverbank. I hastily pulled on my boots, picked up the Colt, and walked. I felt both anger and curiosity. It was definitely one of the women. But he shouldn't have been alone at this hour. The figure was easy to track. It was one of those classic moonlit starry nights on the Great Plains of Colorado. When the figure reached the riverbank, it knelt down and appeared to be praying. I lurked behind a poplar tree and just watched. All I could hear was the rushing of the river. Then, to my amazement, the choking sobs began. They turned into anguished cries of "Why?" She fell face down on the ground with her hands above her head in supplication and made primal sounds of agony. I jumped out, ready to rush to her. Then it occurred to me that she had chosen that time and place because she wanted privacy. I just needed to wait there and make sure she was safe. So I stepped behind a tree. I was also puzzled. Who was this woman and what was the cause of so much suffering? Finally, the wailing stopped and the woman staggered to her feet. She started up the path past me, still sobbing softly. She came out into the clearing we had created by chopping wood for the fire, and the full moon illuminated her face. My heart almost stopped. It was Amy. I lurked behind a tree and watched her walk by. She never noticed me. Her eyes were downcast. I turned to rush back to the wagon before she discovered what I had witnessed, when suddenly I heard a coquettish voice say, "What are you doing here, little lady?" I recognized the voice. It was Wilbert Cooper, one of the train guards. He was a scruffy-looking fellow, about Pat's height, a shiftless tramp. He was mostly useless, but apparently he was the one assigned to patrol the camp tonight. Amy stopped. She could be seen doing calculations. Her long raven hair was braided, and she was wearing a light change of clothes. She realized she was helpless if this guy got any ideas. Of course, Amy wasn't a mediocre Violet. She was experienced at what she did. She turned and said in a seductive tone, "Just had to do some nighttime business. What's on your mind, Cher?" It was obvious that Amy was just playing for time, but her tone of voice and the way her body shifted killed me. I thought, you know what it is. She's protecting herself the only way she knows how. But the thought of Amy doing something like that as payment for her grief was too strong. So I stepped out from behind the tree and said in a threatening tone, "I've got this cowboy in my hands, so why don't you go back to what you've been doing?" It startled them both. Amy jumped up and covered her face. She began to let out a high-pitched, shrill cry. She realized that I had seen her on the riverbank. Cooper pulled out a fat Navy Colt. He pointed it at me and said with a smirk, "I'm going to accept this gift from her. We all know who she is." The first thing you learn in a gunfight is that the best option is an instant attack, and the more sudden and powerful the better. I had a .44 at my foot, so Cooper thought it was harmless. He knew I wouldn't get a shot off before he pulled the trigger. But what he didn't realize was that the barrel lengthens my already long leg. I stepped to his left. It took him a fatal second to move the barrel of his Colt. That was enough time for me to swing my gun and lift his arm into the air. I followed that up with a crushing blow to his ribs. Something crunched. He yelped and fell backward. Then I lunged at him like an enraged grizzly. I ripped the gun out of his hand, threw it into the thicket, twirled it around, and pinned his arms to his sides. God, he stank. I was already thinking of wringing his neck. He was much smaller than me and wiry and thin, but I didn't want Amy to see that, so instead I said, "Apologize to the lady, cowboy." He hesitated. I tightened my grip. He screamed in agony. I felt his ribs stir. He gasped, "I'm sorry." I let go of him. He staggered and fell to his knees. I gave him a blow to the head that put him out of commission for good. He would have a bad headache in the morning and probably broken ribs, but at least he would be alive. Amy looked at me with clouded eyes, and I realized I had to say something. I spread my hands in a sincere gesture and said, "I wasn't spying on you, honestly. I was spying on you because I wanted to make sure you were okay. That's all. You're very important to me." She looked shocked. Then she gave me a long look and said, "I understand very well. I'll tell you about it someday." With those words, she walked easily past me and climbed back into the wagon. The next morning, Amy was as withdrawn as usual, as if the night before had never happened. Most of the train continued on toward Raton Pass and Santa Fe, but 5 wagons and our stage turned up the Arkansas River. In the direction we were headed, there was a wall of mountains. Fortunately, we were traveling no farther than Pueblo. We will then turn north on the old Trappers Trail, which was the preferred route through the Sierra Madres. The Trappers Trail was 40 years old. It was used by Fremont and Kearny on their early expeditions westward. It led north from Pueblo, along the Rocky Mountain Front Range, east of Pikes Peak, and on across the Continental Divide, between the Arkansas and South Platte rivers. We were making our tedious way across high plains with endless short grass prairie. The terrain looked as if anything with hooves walked on it. Herds of buffalo, deer, even cattle. The Indians remained invisible, which suited me just fine, since this was Apache territory. Water was extremely important in this arid landscape, so the trail ran along a series of creeks. We had been walking for several days, mostly northwest, when we reached a place called Jimmy Camp. Jimmy Camp is a former trading post named for the crude adobe shack that Jimmy Hayes, an early trader, built in a low spot by the creek. It was rumored that he was buried there. Jimmy's camp was known for its crystal clear spring, and there was plenty of grass for grazing, and cool shade provided by pine and cottonwood trees. At this point, the Trapper Trail branched northward, and we planned to reach the Cherry Creek Trail. It ran along a tributary of the South Platte River and led directly into Denver, which is where we were headed. As we approached the end of our journey, I began to feel some serious dissatisfaction. For months, Amy had been my constant companion. She always sat beside me in her skivvies with Henry resting on her lap, self-sufficient and mysterious. A deep bond had developed between us, though neither of us would admit it. However, in reality, my faithful partner was doing her job. I didn't think about whether it was right or wrong. I had righteous indignation to fall back on in the case of Vera. But with Amy, it was never about betrayal. From the moment we met, I knew what her profession was. But on the other hand, my closest and only life partner had to start work as soon as she arrived in Denver, and that kept me on my toes. I even sensed an irony in our circumstances. It was clear that Amy just wanted someone to love, and at the same time, she could never get that love because of what she was doing. This impossible paradox was like a dam holding back the river of our mutual desire. I assumed Amy felt it too, and she kept me at a distance to put us both out of our misery. Still, it made us the closest pair of strangers in the entire West. We'd never said 2 words to each other about our past. But I couldn't imagine the circumstances that could make such a strong and intelligent woman take such a path. I understood why the other women were in the trade. Aphrodite and Bathsheba were free now, but they had been sold to May as slaves. I never knew for sure, but Lynn and the 3 Mexican girls were probably in the same boat. Abigail was the same because she had a few cogs. Nevertheless, what made a strong, energetic, and totally awesome creature like Amy humiliate herself like that? Adding to the mystery was Amy's performance at the riverside a month ago. I'd never seen so much grief in my life. It made the mourning I'd done the day I'd learned of Faith's betrayal seem almost frivolous. Whatever was driving this, it would surely reveal the secret of the woman I had fallen so hopelessly in love with. But alas, I could only find out if Amy told me. Until then, she had not shown the slightest inclination to reveal herself. Most of the time, Amy treated me as if I were her man. She did everything a wife is supposed to do. She cooked and took care of my daily needs. She even washed my union suit from time to time. She said the trip would be much more pleasant if I didn't stink. Women! The only thing she didn't take care of was my wishes, but I didn't expect her to. And it wasn't that she was selling them for money. It was clear that Amy's night butterfly was the armor she wore whenever she had to face the harsh reality of a life red with teeth and claws. The other Amy behaved just the opposite. Random flashes of a deeply devoted and caring woman under the false flag of a fatalistic wench were heartbreaking. After unhitching and tying the mules, I sat in the late afternoon sun and pondered our bleak situation. At that moment, I heard a shot from a 10-bore gun. It came from the direction of the spring. I grabbed both .44 caliber pistols and rushed down the trail toward the sound. There was a rumble of gunfire, followed by shouts and screams. I rushed to the clearing around the spring. When I got there, I found 5 panicked women taking turns. They were clearly bathing, but Amy was pushing the lever of the Henry to fire another shot, and Aphrodite was vigorously reloading the 10-shooter. The sight of the monumental Aphrodite was slightly more intimidating than the huge mountain range to the west of us. I had an inappropriate thought. How is Pat ever going to get over this? Pat had just risen to his feet and was visibly dizzy. A few paces away from him lay what appeared to be a breathless Indian, and from the direction Amy had shot, there were shouts. Everything stopped when I appeared. The girls kept shouting and pointing toward the howlers, which were getting farther away. Amy took one last shot, and then walked quickly over to me, clutching Henry in her hands. For the first time ever, I could see that she was excited. She said in a strained voice, "They took my sister. We have to go after her." I said, not understanding, "Sister? What sister?" Amy replied without further explanation, "Abigail." She then turned to run after the departing raiders. I grabbed her hand and said, "Hang on. You won't get far in sandals and a change of clothes. I'll go with you. But we need to do some preparation." I finally admitted that I was willing to do anything for this woman, even face a Comanche raid. I had no idea why golden-haired beauty Amy thought pale patrician Abigail was her sister, but for the first time in my life, I saw a real woman, and she was scared. I looked her over and added calmly, like getting suitable clothing, ammunition, and some food. 15 minutes later, Amy was dressed in her buckskins, and a couple saddlebags with Henry's ammo were slung over the back of her mule. I tried to hold my ground. I'm a sailor, not a cowboy. I had a .44 in 2 holsters. We left the 10-wheeler at Pat's. He promised to take the Conestoga to Denver, and there we would meet him and the rest of the girls. Amy assigned Aphrodite to take her place. It was an excellent choice. She could drive better than I could, and with Aphrodite, no one would be out of line. We rode our mules down the obvious trail the raiders had left, traveling west from the spring to the rugged terrain a couple miles away. There were plenty of ravines for them to hide in, but they kept moving toward the mountains. Amy said there were originally 3 of them. They came out of the thicket of trees behind where they were standing, took Pat by surprise, and hit him with a tomahawk. Apparently, Irish skulls are immune to tomahawks, or the point was blunt, because he just passed out. Pat was talking to Aphrodite at the time, and the 2 of them were talking all the time. So Aphrodite grabbed Pat's 10-gun and shot the one with the tomahawk. Amy ran up to Henry, who she leaned against a tree, and shot the other 2. That convinced them to run, but they grabbed Abigail, who of course was running in the wrong direction. The tracks we were following joined a larger group about a mile into our pursuit, which changed the situation completely. I could probably deal with the original intruders myself, but there was nothing I could do about the whole tribe. We began to walk cautiously down the trail. The trail was made easier by the fact that herbivores were moving along with the group. They were chewing on the ground as we went along. It seemed as if we were following a whole group. We followed them through the night. I was getting used to riding a mule, and Amy rode as if she had been born on a horse. There seemed to be nothing in the physical universe that she couldn't do. The men we tracked were camped on high ground 10 miles north-northwest of where they had abducted Abigail. It must have been a large family. There were several teepees and several campfires. We waited until it was completely dark to sneak to the perimeter of the camp. It was easy because there was a whole bunch of ravines leading there. Amy always carried Henry with her. I thought it was just an act, but she obviously knew how to use it. She was also not shy about crawling over rocks and vegetation like an army scout. We reached the edge of the camp, which was a circle of 6 teepees with a large fire in the middle, and began exploring one teepee at a time. It was absolutely dark, with only the stars and the dying fire illuminating the scene. No one stood guard, but there were a few dogs roaming nearby. The dogs were supposed to sound the alarm if anyone came near. We kept against the wind and moved silently from teepee to teepee. Once in a while we heard movement inside, but there was no sign of Abigail. I began to wonder what we would do even if we found her. We certainly couldn't walk up to 30 or more hostile Indians and politely ask them to bring our little sister back. It was at that moment that the screams of a woman being bludgeoned to breathlessness came from the clearing to our right. It could have been anyone. But Amy immediately jumped to her feet and ran up the path. Perhaps she recognized the screams. I scattered a handful of pemmican and followed her. I thought, this should distract the dogs. When I reached the clearing, I found the 2 women arguing loudly. Amy was covering one of the 2 Indians, Henry, and the other was next to Abigail. The Indian who was next to Abigail watched the 2 women shouting at each other in puzzlement. Apparently, kidnapping had given Abigail great pleasure, and she wasn't about to turn down such a tasty offer of rich men. Had I mentioned that Abigail was in over her head? The gist of Amy's argument was that she had lost her business value, not her sisterly concern. I asked, stunned, "What's going on? Isn't she on her way?" Amy turned to me in annoyance and said, "The little girl likes it here and wants to stay." I said, trying to sound reasonable, "Then why don't we let her?" Abigail added, "Yes," Amy said, "she's my sister. I can't leave her." Abigail replied, "They take good care of me, and I like it here." The 2 Indians began nodding vigorously. They obviously did not know English, but they understood what Abigail was saying. I said to Abigail, "If we leave you now, there's no turning back. You're completely on your own." Abigail said, "These people care for each other. They are like a big family. I haven't felt this free and happy since Daddy sold Marie-Aimee." Now that was another discouraging piece of news. Amy looked at me with horror. I said as firmly as I could, "So you want to stay here with these people?" Abigail nodded enthusiastically and said, "That is my wish. Now, leave me alone." I took Amy's hand and led her down the trail to where our mules were tethered. She seemed to be crying. The mystery remained long enough. I promised myself that I would get the story out of my beautiful friend as soon as we found a place to sleep. The area we were in was still high mountain plains, but it was close enough to the mountains that there were cliffs and caves. I had no desire to find out what lived in the depths of the cave, but there was a well-weathered area under a sheer cliff that gave us a few feet of shelter. If we built a fire at the mouth, we might be able to sleep without disturbance from the local wildlife, and the Indians seemed to be pacified, thanks to Abigail. In our saddlebags we had flasks of water, pemmican, and coffee. I gathered enough wood to make a fire. Then, while I tucked the mules in for the night, Amy cooked us something hearty, if not gourmet. She still remained mysterious. But in one short day, she'd gone from gorgeous New Orleans fashionista to Kit Carson. We had saddles and blankets to sleep on. It was time to open the curtain, and I said emphatically, "You said you'd tell me about it someday. I think now is the time." Amy didn't work that way. She didn't trust anyone. All pretense left her splendid face. She turned her incredible violet eyes on me and said with an anxious feeling, "You first." So I told her the whole sad story, from my growing up, my fascination with whaling, my inevitable marriage to my childhood sweetheart, to her devastating betrayal. I added, "That night I got drunk and with any luck was dragged off the dock into slavery." Amy looked shocked. Now I knew that slavery was part of her biography. I hastily added, It took fate and the federal government to free me from that hellish ship. I finished. I snuck into New Orleans and you witnessed the rest. Then I added grimly, I made a vow to myself that someday I would settle my differences with Mr. Briggs. That promise is all that is holding me back. She was staring at me intently, and it was like the way winter ice melts on the first warm day of spring. Her hitherto impassive expression changed, and the real woman, the person underneath that feline demeanor, began to emerge. We were sitting on the ground across from each other, a fire burning between us. Amy gave us a confused look, then got up and came over to sit next to me. I turned to her with a questioning look. She took my face in her dainty little hands and kissed me. It broke the dam, and a tidal wave of contained feelings flooded our lives. We sat on saddle blankets that smelled of mule, but as unromantic as the circumstances were, we both knew it had to happen. I had to cut out a little bit of YouTube too, but I'll remind you again that a free trial with the full story is available on our Patreon. Amy is an exotic creature, deep, mysterious, and colorful. She radiates attractiveness just by eating breakfast. You can imagine what she's like when her emotions are stirred. More importantly, there was nothing in the way she reacted to me that suggested to me that she wasn't completely lost in her own desire. Amy wasn't a lady of the night. She was my lover. When sanity finally returned to me, I found Amy lying infinitely very still. She was either coming to or coming to. I turned her over so that she was lying next to me. I raised up on my elbow and looked down at her. Her eyes came back into focus. She was far away. Her first words completely stunned me. She said in surprise, I've never had that before. It was stupid to say it at such an opportune moment, but I had to say it. I sincerely said, I love you. The pain in her eyes was unimaginable. She said, let me tell you my story first. Then you can make a decision. So we lay next to each other in the night, looking up at the stars over the vast Colorado prairie. The fire outlined the edges of Amy's body as she told me her story. In many ways, it was a simple consequence of the society she was born into. But it was tragic. More importantly, it explained everything. The Melancons were wealthy Arcadian planters in rural Baton Rouge. Grandfather Aristide began the tradition of childbirth by giving birth to a baby girl by a beautiful slave girl named Leonie. The child grew up among the household staff, and she in turn inherited her mother's beauty. In fact, the daughter was so beautiful that Aristide's son Augustine took her as his wife, essentially as his left hand. This may seem a bit odd, given that they were half-siblings, but extra-legal marriages to exceptionally beautiful slave girls were common among planters. This made the wives full members of the family. Amy's mother, Marielle, was more of a wife to Augustin than his real spouse, Viola, who was the daughter of a member of the legislature in neighboring Baton Rouge. They were all one big, happy family. Abigail was born to Viola, and Amy was born to Marielle. The two girls grew up together like sisters until they began to turn into women. It was then that their brother Bruno came to their attention. Bruno was in his early 20s, a physical specimen, a legendary leader of the Greenville Rifles, and an all-around corrupter. Amy said, first there was Abigail. She was 2 years older. I thought, that explains it. Amy added, it did something to her. It was like her only raison d'être after that was you-know-what. Amy added sadly, she willingly came with me to Maze. Amy's mother knew that her daughter would inevitably suffer from Bruno's attentions. She was a generic beauty. That's why Marielle had made a childbirth contract with Augustine. This gave Amy some rights, although both mother and daughter were still legally slaves. Accordingly, at the age of 18, Amy found herself bound to a monster. And of course, since she was a slave, she had to submit to his every fantasy. Her beautiful face took on an expression of absolute disgust when she said, I will never tell you what he did to me. Her only friend was another slave, a servant boy her age named Nestor. Amy told me that Nestor was a sweet and gentle soul. She would pour out her misery to him in the dark of night, and he would embrace and comfort her. Gradually, the comforting turned into something else. Bruno was beyond thrilled when Amy became pregnant. It would be the first child in the next generation, and he had already chosen a name for Bruno Etienne Melançon Jr. He was even getting better at relating to his mother. That was until a dark-skinned baby was born. It only took a few tries to get the information to find out the perpetrator's name. With those words, Amy rolled onto her side to show me the scars on her smooth back. The revenge that followed was merciless. Nestor was sold to a cotton plantation in Alabama. No one lived long there. The baby was sold upriver. He didn't fetch much. But the purpose was revenge, not profit. And Amy was sold to May's in New Orleans. Fortunately, it was May. May was a compassionate woman. She emancipated Amy and allowed her to live in semi-luxury. All Amy had to do was entertain a few clients. There weren't that many, and May enforced a strict code of behavior. Amy was always treated well. She paused, and then looked at me intently, wanting me to understand. I was property, not a person. All my life I was disrespected. I had no concept of kindness or even humanity. So, of course I did everything this generous woman told me to do. She was my savior. Amy added aloofly, evenings with men were completely impersonal. It was a chore. I was doing it to repay my benefactor and keep a roof over my head. Amy's voice deepened, reflecting her deep grief. There was an absolute void in my heart. I had lost my beautiful baby. My grief was all-consuming. I cried every night and prayed for his salvation. This is what you saw by the river. She said grimly, my soul has always been protected in the citadel of myself. It was the only way I was able to survive. People see the walls. They never touch what's inside. Then she looked at me lovingly and said, with a growing note of concern, I'm not like that. We've been together for almost a year now. You're a good man. You won't hurt me, and you'll protect me. She paused, as if tensing up, and added, I want to open the gate and let you, and only you, into my heart. But please understand, it would kill me if you betrayed me. I had several thoughts. The first was joy. This gorgeous woman had just told me everything. The second was relief that I wasn't playing the martyr for Faith's betrayal. I would have looked like an idiot compared to Amy's suffering. And finally, I was completely devoted to her. Clearly, Amy was a superb beauty. She would always be a great and caring life partner. But that was not the basis of my choice. Amy's spirit was the deciding factor. The strength of her character and intelligence. Her gallant willingness to fight even in the face of hopeless odds. It was the ingredient that no other woman had. Moreover, Amy was always an honest and caring person. She did not treat others the way they treated her. She gave them empathy and respect. That was what made her remarkable. If I had Amy's life experience, I would have been an axe murderer. From the glamorous world of New Orleans to the untamed wilderness of the American frontier, our characters have faced challenges that would break lesser souls. Betrayal, love, loyalty, and the complexities of human nature have all come to the fore in this thrilling saga. As we witnessed, even amidst the harsh realities of the West, the human spirit can find unexpected connections and resilience. But our journey is far from over. With a shocking twist at the end of this chapter, we're left hanging on the edge of our seats. What will happen to Abigail? Will Amy and our protagonist find a way to rescue her? And what dangers lurk ahead in the heart of the unknown? Join us next time as we delve deeper into this epic adventure filled with daring escapes, unexpected alliances, and the unyielding spirit of the American frontier. Until then, let us know your theories in the comments below.